So first and foremost, I just wanted to honor the indigenous peoples of this land and acknowledge the fact that we are all gathered here today on the traditional homelands of the Lakota peoples. I'd like to remember and mourn the violent history of dispossession perpetrated and perpetuated by the government of the United States of America and its people. That history of harm against the Lakota peoples, as we heard earlier and most of you know, is not something separate from this gathering, but is something that has made this gathering possible. And as a sign of love and respect, I'd like to seek permission from the elders that are decision makers of the Lakota peoples to pass through this land and to do the work that we are all here to do today. So if there are any elders here today that can grant me permission to speak, I would welcome that. Okay, I hope we will be able to have this serve as a testament to the Lakota peoples. So I'm honored to be here today, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and my fellow panelists for being here. Looking over the program, it's incredibly exciting to see the kinds of exchanges that I'm sure will be happening here over the next couple of days. And as someone who is still a relative newcomer to this field, at least as a practitioner and as a theorist of reparations, I'm really looking forward to learning from some of those of you who have made this really your life's pursuit and the primary focus of your activism, your scholarship, and your teaching. I come to this as an activist, and I come to this as a historian, and until very recently, the history of reparations, I'm sorry to say, has not been a major topic of concern for historians. I know tomorrow we'll be hearing from my dear sister, Ana Lucia Araujo, whose book on the international efforts for reparations for the slave trade, enacted by peoples of African descent, is one of only a handful of books right now dealing with how reparations as an idea has developed historically as a transnational praxis. So we have ground to make up as historians of this movement, and I welcome any of you who are able to help me from your perspectives in thinking through how to make up this gap. So I'd like to talk today about our panel's theme of exploring different models of reparative action. I'd like to do this by tracing very roughly the global history of reparations as I see it, not for slavery per se, as I know Anna's going to be kind of talking about that later or tomorrow, but reparations more generally. I'm very interested in both the practice and the idea of reparations internationally and how it connects to the radical black tradition. I'm fascinated at the possibility that a new and incredibly dynamic praxis may be developing internationally as we speak, quite literally, not just into a successful political project, as we have many examples, but an entirely new conceptualization of justice itself. This new model of justice and new way of thinking about justice and new way of doing justice has the potential, I believe, to remake the global political economy like no other force I see on the horizon today. By fundamentally altering the way that the world understands harm and the responsibilities we all have to set harm right, we can truly transform not only the material conditions and the social relations of our world, but the very nature of human subjectivity itself in the 21st century. So much like Michel Foucault charted the forces of modernity and the ways in which that transformed human beings and human understanding of subjectivity and what that means to be human, it is entirely possible that future historians will one day look upon this moment of reparations as a turning point where human nature transformed itself once again. So how do we tell this history of reparations? I think it's a mistake to begin such a tale with the long history of war reparations in the ancient world for a number of reasons that I think should be pretty obvious. First of all, war reparations are rooted in punitive and domineering impulses. While the payment of war reparations in the ancient world may have been a step above mass slaughter, I don't think it's a genealogy, and I don't think that's a good starting point for the kinds of reparations that I'm hoping will become normative. While I deeply admire the indigenous practices of repair that can be seen in ancient Africa, Asia, and the Americas, I frankly know very little about them, and I look forward to learning more about them in the days ahead here. So while these ancient practices should certainly be regarded as origins of reparations in the sense that they come first chronologically, we still need to map out how causally they worked their way historically into what I see as our current transnational reparations consciousness. So rather than starting with the earliest example of reparations, let's instead start by going backwards from our current moment to see if we can find some thread that ties reparations thinking today together in an uninterrupted way. So my spontaneous response is to say that such a continuity can be found in formerly enslaved peoples as the archetypal modern subjects who early in the 1790s began asking for reparations for slavery. But this is a trap, I think, because not unlike ancient forms of repair, these early calls by enslaved peoples seem to have been repeatedly lost for several generations at a time. So Belinda's petition, for example, was largely forgotten by Cayley House, who was largely forgotten by Queen Mother More, until historians rediscovered them all and intentionally put these three just amazing black women into conversation with one another. So for African Americans prior to Queen Mother More and the Republic of New Africa in the 1960s, each conceptualization of repair appears to have emerged organically and almost entirely independently. So I think we need to look elsewhere. So while a sense of justice and correcting wrongs might be thought of as a timeless, innate kind of part of human nature, we all see injustice and try to go ahead and do something about it. I think that's a far too loose and a far too generous understanding of human nature to have any real explanatory power, at least historically. So while reparations theorist Howard Zur described the historical development of a modern-day reparations movement as coming from a number of twisting tributary rivers, all kind of starting to converge into one global reparations consciousness, I think where those rivers each start and where they link up to our current moment, I think really matters. So for me, the great mountain that kind of started this trickling down of the longest uninterrupted stream we have of reparations thought, I think can be found in the Black radical tradition and in the traditions of Black international socialism. So in responding to the ravages of modernity, to the brutality of capitalism, and to the radical development of an instrumental rationality that still continues to treat human beings as units of labor to be abused and discarded at will, socialism, in my mind, is the first lasting intellectual tradition to think systematically about the harms of modernity and the possible pathways to transform that harm into a world of justice. Now, while this may sound on the surface to be a Eurocentric or even a polemical kind of starting point, that's only the case if we ignore the Black radical tradition and the countless unnamed organic socialist thinkers, like, say, the formerly enslaved T. Thomas Fortune, who was one of the first Black advocates of socialism. There's no real evidence he ever read a single socialist text, right? He organically came to this conclusion that we need to, in kind of the words of Afro-pessimists, destroy the world, right? We need to destroy this world and build up an entirely new one. So I think this is a valid starting point. So within this very broad socialist tradition, anarchist thought strikes me as a particularly relevant stream of thought. The first theorist of reparations, if you kind of put a gun to my head and say, who was the first theorist of reparations, I would probably say Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and this is in the 1840s. His famous declaration, right, that property is theft, which I think is incredibly stunning when you approach that with indigenous understandings of land ownership, or not ownership, but stewardship, right, that property itself is theft. Proudhon was conceptualizing harm in a very broad spectrum. If the privatization of the commons had stolen something precious from humanity, Proudhon's prescription of redress was simple: abolish property and give it back to the commons. If the state had emerged as a harm-inducing machine that enabled the further theft of collective labor, the corrective repair was also simple: abolish the state. If capitalism was stealing from workers by capturing and privatizing surplus value, Proudhon held that reparations for workers required ending capitalism to ensure the non-repetition of future harm, which is one of the UN categories. If factories were abusing children, ripping off limbs, destroying the ecosystem because its owners regarded all such things as externalities, then reparations demanded those factories be turned over to workers themselves, who would run factories in a way that protected themselves from the ravages of capitalism. This unapologetic and unwavering position demanded that large-scale injustices must be repaired by large-scale and truly transformative remedies. The radical piece must be just as radical as the radical violence that broke it. These anarchist ideas have continued unabated, I mean, obviously with changes, and as such, I think places Proudhon as a founding theorist of reparations today. Now, while Marx slightly disagreed with Proudhon on the nature of property and argued that a collectivization and a redistribution of wealth, at least temporarily, rather than its immediate abolition, was kind of the starting point, Marx's version of socialism developed an even more complex theory of reparations while building on Proudhon. In the order of operations necessary to bring about Marx's communist utopia, this entire project, during the socialist phase at least, should be understood as an attempt to repair the global scourge of capitalism by returning to the proletariat that which was unjustly taken from them. The primary aim of the dictatorship of the proletariat, for example, would have been in an ideal world repairing the harm of the prior state formations while creating a mechanism to address prior, present, and future harms until such time as a state of pre-harm equality could put humanity back on track, as it were. So while we don't have time to analyze all of the successes and failures of these ideas once put into practice in a variety of contexts and in a variety of these degrees around the world, both the statist and the anarchist tendencies in socialism contain what I believe to be the ideological seeds that have blossomed into the various branches of our modern reparations thinking today, even if everyone who practices and advocates for reparations today is consciously unaware of it. So not only is reparations a socialist demand, but socialism itself is a reparative demand, and I think that's important to think through. This revelation, I think, has a number of consequences. So historically, socialist revolutions around the world in the 20th century can therefore be seen not only as part of a global reaction against modernity, but an attempt at reparations. Such uprisings and demands for a fully transformed society should be understood as part of an ever-emerging global reparations consciousness that has remained with us today. Peasants in China, urban workers in Latin America, labor unions in Europe, and formerly enslaved peoples in the Caribbean understood socialism as a way to right the wrongs of the modern world collectively and permanently. Socialism is therefore a phase zero of the reparations movement, and there have been roughly 3 phases that I'm going to run through that have been kind of previously recognized by people who do this history. It should come as no surprise, I think, that in the wake of successive world wars brought on by European colonialism and continued state violence, that the impulses to remake the world began to look beyond national boundaries, first through international socialism, and then through the successive formations of the League of Nations in 1920 and then the United Nations in 1945. As the hatred, nationalism, and racism that fueled so much of the modern world exposed itself nakedly in the Holocaust, it should come as no surprise also that this great turning point in reparations history was understood within the specter of socialism fully in sight. The cash reparations to Holocaust survivors and the State of Israel, many of whom were drawing upon socialist and anarchist ideas in formulating reparations, while often cited as the start of phase 1 in the global reparations movement, was still largely framed, unfortunately, as a punitive measure. It was also only undertaken, it must be said, because that reparations for the Holocaust was in the service of America's geopolitical interests at the start of the Cold War. By using provisions of the Marshall Plan, the American state was able to fund the reparations plans to Israel through West Germany, which bolstered not only the legitimacy and the economy of the West German state, but also indebted the state of Israel to the United States, giving Americans a vital ally in the Middle East. Now, rather than permit the real transformative reparations that socialism promised, or allow the self-organized Jewish anarchist collectives in Palestine, known as the kibbutzim, to continue living peacefully with their Palestinian neighbors, the American model of reparations, which came to a check and a state, was a way to co-opt these socially inspired reparations and deliver a more conservative, individualistic approach to the question of reparations. Unsurprisingly, and by design, and this is what we might call a neoliberal brand of reparations today, this did very little to solve the underlying social ills of inequality wrought by capitalism and violence in the name of empire. Indeed, reparations, in the case of Israel, stripped of its socialist impulses, stood in the service of empire. This is a pattern that would continue with reparations to Japanese Americans, which was also part of America's Cold War strategy in the Pacific, while serving to establish Japanese Americans as a model minority at home and the only officially worthy victim of American racism. However, if phase one of the reparations movement was primarily punitive, it also critically moved the repair of harms into something that occurred not only between nations, but entire populations as well as individuals. So phase two in the development of reparations is often traced to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, while flawed in any number of ways that I'm happy to get into, it pushed forward reparations discourse in a critical way as it departed almost entirely from a retributive or punitive model of justice and attempted, however unsuccessfully, to move forward a truly reparative, survivor-centric model. So this was a break, a very sharp break in global understandings of justice. And the ties to the ANC, African National to socialism, are very well known, so it's still within that framework. While this landed, in the end, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on universal amnesty, and it did very little to address the underlying inequality of the apartheid regime, this very failure opened the door to what is often called phase three of the reparations movement. And this brings us to the point where I think we are today, and this concept of transformative justice. And this is where I think the socialist roots of reparations really become obvious, right? That reparations is not a state and a check, but that reparations requires the transformation of the entire social structure that is producing harm to begin with. So what we're seeing in this third phase, and I think Rwanda and Sierra Leone are two of the examples often put forward as case studies, as emblematic of this third phase. What we're seeing is that repair for the past demands a complete, multi-pronged transformation that makes the conditions that caused harm in the first place to become actually unthinkable. Anything less than a full revolution will not do when we are talking about crimes against humanity. If nothing else, the magnitude of massive human rights violations creates opportunities proportionate to that harm. We have multiple examples in places like, take the Harlem Kid Zone, that changing everything at once leads to far better outcomes than trying to cobble together some technocratic tweak on the cheap. So hopefully this gives an overview of how I kind of see reparations. I know there's not a lot of specifics, but I'll be on a panel later while talking more kind of on the ground as to what this kind of bigger understanding of reparations would hopefully look like. I'd just like to say in closing that whatever models of repair we build going forward, they must be horizontally built, they must be thoroughly democratic in their design, and they must actually repair the harm of the past, stop the harm in the present, and create an entirely new society in which future harms will be impossible, if not unthinkable. Reparations are not a neoliberal demand. They are not a reform movement. They are not a project or a policy. Reparations are a way of being. They are a never-ending praxis. They are justice in full. They require the healing of broken relationships. They require the rolling up of this poor excuse we call a civilization and building a completely new, beautiful world in its place. A world filled with love, peace, equality, and justice. Reparations now and reparations forever. Thank you.